Premier, we just heard from you, so maybe I want to kind of jump into the conversation first with Brandon, and not only as the chair of this organization, but also as a person who's exploring and developing in the Yukon. You've been familiar with it, for your entire life. I kind of want to ask you about how this critical minerals momentum shift over the last couple of years has really changed the direction of explorers here in Yukon, and kind of maybe some things you've observed on the ground and conversations you've had with government officials and foreign officials as well.
Yeah, I would say that there's a momentum. It's still nascent, right? This critical minerals zeitgeist or whatever. This excitement behind it. The most tangible thing probably that's actually impacting us right now is the critical mineral exploration tax credit, which was by the federal government, which just helps lower our cost of capital a little bit. The on the ground stuff, I see you've got the feds talking about this infrastructure funds available. You've got a lot of discussion about the importance of critical minerals. But it's been really, you look at the trajectory of this conversation. It started in late 2022, so we're less than a year and a half into it, and so it's a little nascent. Still a lot of rhetoric, and that's not saying that critically. I'm just saying it takes some time to go from this is important to action. So I'm happy with the momentum, but I think really it's going to be 2024 and 2025 and onwards where we see discussion lead to results.
Michael, there's very few projects that you haven't shifted through, and so specifically with the Yukon, talk about the opportunities you see here as an analyst to really kind of filling this need moving forward.
Yeah, in terms of critical minerals in particular, we see a lot of potential. Copper Gold Casino project that's at the feasibility stage, ready to go into the permitting process. It would be Canada's biggest development project by GDP. So it's really, really important as far as I'm concerned. I think the projects, Fireweed's projects, both Mac Pass and Mac Tongue are very, very important. And I think they could open up infrastructure both on the road side and power side, as the Premier alluded to. So I think they're really important. The gold discoveries are also an undercurrent. They're kind of socializing permitting of mines, which is really, really important to me as an analyst, and that's the feedback I get from institutional investors.
Socializing permitting of mines. What do you mean by that? Well,
I think, the Premier and Brandon can correct me, but with Victoria Gold being the Yukon's biggest gold mine ever, open pit, in a First Nations territory that is embracing, as far as I can see, the economic revenues. That's the change, and that's a signal that I'm getting from investors that Yukon's open. Snowline has made a tremendous discovery. It's put the global spotlight on the Yukon, and to have a project go from $25 million market cap to over 900 in a matter of 2 years, and probably be one of the most globally significant, is also brought attention to the Yukon, and that plays into critical minerals in terms of the attention as well.
So what is the next big development play in critical minerals there in Yukon, not precious metals? I mean, are you looking at a fireweed?
Yeah, I mean, it's if I can quote Brandon down at Beaver Creek, and we actually published this, we thought it was so great. He said when we put out our next resource, it'll have a triple-digit increase, and that it will actually, give investors a bit of a religious experience when they see it. So that's coming from.
And I don't think you have to talk up. You can just look at the practicality, the facts of it, which is our Macdonald project has been through the environmental assessment. No other major. Well, actually, Katsakaya, we should say. We always think about pubcos, but BMC's Katsakaya, if they can get that ironed out, really will be the next critical minerals project constructed in Yukon. And I think, you talk about the excitement of Snowline, and one of the challenges we have is that investors, I think we all agree that critical minerals are necessary, but investors are looking for returns, right? And they're not going to invest in a fireweed because they think zinc and tungsten are important. They're investing because they want returns. And so the challenge, I think one of the major challenges in the critical mineral space is there's simply far more capital available for precious metals mining than there is for critical metals. That's period. That's an absolute fact, right? So we say we think these things are important, yet the capital is not there for it.
If I may put a selfish plug out there, Premier Pillai and I did an interview back in November in Frankfurt, and if you go back to the podcast, it was a great, and we talked about for about a half an hour about a lot of the infrastructure discussion that keeps happening in Yukon. On this, in critical minerals here, Premier, I guess you have to remain a little bit competitive up in the territory because seems like every territory, every province has their own sort of critical minerals declaration moving forward. Obviously, in the U.S., we have a massive one, but what we're kind of waiting for is how you get from point A to point B, knowing that it's not just going to happen in one fell swoop. There's going to be about dozens of steps you have to accomplish to get to that point. So how do you move from basically ink on paper in this agenda to investors and people watching, like seeing actionable items being taken?
Yeah, it's a complex conversation. I mean, look, you're not going to. It's not one straight line of strategy to undertake or to optimize the opportunity. I think when we look at it quickly, I would say that the key things that every mining investor wants to look at, how are you keeping your regulatory process strong so that you're in a modern context looking after the environment, but you're not, continue to go through duplication. Like we have work to do, but that work is being done. And I think that that's very important. It doesn't matter what the jurisdiction is. You're going to hear some feedback on that. And, there's always going to be folks that understand the importance of this conversation. And there's going to be folks that, maybe need to be more educated on the importance of what we're doing. I think that continuing to invest in infrastructure, I think doing this, like we talked about earlier today, having government and industry, but also more importantly, First Nations development corporations from the Yukon are here throughout the weekend. Our First Nations leaders, I'm in meetings tomorrow. We've been in meetings on this. I mean, it's key. And the Yukon, it's about all Yukoners being at the table. And I think the first thing is ensuring that our companies that are coming in are sitting with Indigenous governments. I mean, Brandon is a very unique example of working in a very sort of remote area of the Yukon, but having spent time growing up there and then having these strong relationships with the community and then in a CEO leadership position. And there's many people in our industry that are that have those connections. And I think which is really important. But yeah, I think the whole country's trying to figure it out. Like everybody's trying to figure it out. We need to extract because we need that particular commodity. Big investments at end use on battery plants. Where does the value add get? We're looking at friendly partners. That's why I was in Japan, because inevitably, we feel that's a great country to be working with, and they've got the infrastructure in place to add to what we're trying to do, and they see the understanding of the values in the Yukon, and they make good partners. But I think it's a key of infrastructure, regulatory, looking at how labor force goes. Our labor force in mining across North America is not what it was many years ago. I come from a family of like multi-generational miners. A lot of my family are not in the industry anymore. But how do we make sure that people still look to work in that industry? So I think those are all key pieces, and understand that this all has to be foundational to economic reconciliation. That is the only way forward. And if you do that, nations will define how they see the benefit and how they support the projects. And there's a huge opportunity. And also, I'll just end by saying, look, it's not just about building infrastructure for renewable energy. It's about what we use for our phones, our computers. It's, you got to understand, when you look at 85% of critical minerals being controlled by one or two players that tend to be not always on the same page as us, we got to get this right.
Well, and maybe directing this to the other two, does it make it easier or harder when each province or territory has their own critical minerals kind of agenda? And the U.S. has its own, amongst its 50 states, and and we obviously have our own problems. But I guess that from an investor and development standpoint, does that make it easier or more difficult? Maybe that's more of a question for Mike.
Well, it probably makes it a little bit more competitive, each one having their own strategy to attract investment. It's been impressive, the investment that's been attracted so far to BC on the battery side, and Ontario, Stellantis, Volkswagen, and then in Quebec and Montreal with Northvolt, the Swedes, putting in $7 billion. So I think it's important to have a strategy, but it really depends on your infrastructure, your power source, in terms of what you can offer. So I think it needs to be separate strategies for different jurisdictions. And I think it's interesting, the Premier mentioned Japan and their interest. I think part of it's driven by the fact that China is now producing more EVs than Japan and Korea combined. And the Inflation Reduction Act of the US has drawn investment into the US and also into Canada. And that's really important. I think it's an underreported story in terms of the Japanese, very interested in Yukon, British Columbia, and elsewhere in Canada.
Well, you've mentioned infrastructure and power, and we've had a long conversation about connecting Yukon to the BC hydropower grid. That's going to be a massive project. But after that, we've got to talk permitting. Under your leadership, what are some of the directions you would like to take Yukon for, improving the permitting process for mines? Because that is a huge issue, not just in Yukon, but almost anywhere.
Look, I think it starts with the environmental assessment. We've worked for the last number of years. It's been a conversation working directly with First Nation governments around how we can remove redundancy. And, I think I'll leave it at this. We've got partners at the table. I have to be extremely respectful of our First Nations partners. And I'll say, I think over the last little bit, we're hitting a very significant spot, which is going to lead to, I think it'll be nation leading when it comes to where we can improve regulatory in the short run. So I'll leave it at that. I'd like to be able to, hopefully be in a position as we go into PDAC or later on this year, having, more of a public conversation. But I'll say I'm happy with where that's going. The mining legislation piece, look, in the Yukon, we have a commitment to work with First Nation governments to co-develop. It's ingrained in the Constitution of Canada. I won't get into a big policy conversation, but that's the commitment. That's the contract that's been in place, and that work's being done right now. So anytime you go through a regulatory, there's a little bit of pain because it's hard work and you're looking at change. But everybody in the world is looking at change in this conversation. And, all you have to do is look at British Columbia, where we are right now, and they're going down the same path. And we see lots of different nations coming to the table, trying to do something innovative as they work through their opportunities. So I think, to answer your question directly, an improvement in the environmental assessment, which means I need to have the federal government on board to make that change. We had mining leaders from the Yukon on the 5th of January have a meeting with the federal minister here in Vancouver. It was very substantial. We want to see change in our Environmental Assessment Act. And the second part is making sure in the short run we roll out a modernized mining legislation. That's key. And I think there's improvements just on scope. It's making sure that scope doesn't continue to creep, which it does all over the place. And I think there has to be some real courageous conversations in the short run on how that will play out. Those are the things we can get done.
What about the timing it takes to get approval or not approval? We have discussions about kind of putting timeline on when the companies can expect to get that news?
Yeah, I think, and it ties into those two things. So if you can reduce the redundancy on the EA process and the scope, it can move quicker. I think that's what, I think part of our challenge has been to be very open with the room is we sometimes are looking at things in the EA process that can be covered in there's three things you need. Okay, you want to open mind. You got to go through an EA process like anywhere else. Then government will put out a decision document. Then you have to get a quartz mine license and you need a water license. Well, I think what we've seen, and we've got really great people, our new deputy minister who's here of of Energy, Mines and Resources, was the former chair of the environmental assessment. Very, very bright individual, strategic hire for us. It's about ensuring that in the front end, you're not doing stuff that already gets covered in the back end. And that's the tough conversations. But it's there. You just need to be bold to do it.
Yeah, I think and of course, the redundancy, the scope creep creates redundancy. And redundancy does not make for a better process, right? I think doing it right once makes more sense than doing it twice, right? So, and I think you have to look at First Nations struggle with capacity, so does government. So when they're struggling with the capacity to address environmental assessments and permit applications, and you're asking them the same question, today and then again in 2 years, they know they're going to get the exact same questions. They're wondering, well, why do I have to get asked this question twice? Why can't you engage with me properly on it once? And so I think there's in many cases that this deduplication is actually beneficial to the First Nations, right? So, and one of the things I mentioned at our meeting with the federal minister was that, YESA, the act, which created YESA, the board, we can definitely improve it, but I think actually just bringing it back to the where it's meant to be within the scope that it was designed for will tighten assessment timelines quite a bit.
Mike, as an analyst, what are some ideas or things that you're watching within the permitting framework that you wish, or if you had to say, you'd want to see changed?
Well, the federal government has in the critical minerals $3.8 billion allocated, been for projects, been for infrastructure, and been for permitting. And I think that's largely related to First Nations related permitting process, and maybe the Premier can speak more to that. But I think that's an important pool of capital that we're waiting to see how it's going to be deployed. There's also $1.8 billion in the Innovation Fund. Minister Champagne is managing that. We're not exactly sure how that's going to be deployed. There's $15 billion in Canada's Growth Fund. Some of that will come to critical minerals. And then there's $38 billion in electrification as the federal government doubles the capacity of Canada in terms of electrification. So there's a lot of pools of capital. We're not sure. So,
do you have anything to add on top of that?
Yeah, no, I think there's a huge appetite to reduce redundancy. So I think what we try to do, I'll bring it back a bit, and Michael did a great job outlining those programs. But you have the federal minister. So the dialogue that we have is the federal minister comes out and makes that commitment. We want to reduce red tape, and politicians say it all the time. We're at the table going, okay, we can deliver you in conjunction with First Nations leadership the very first one of these opportunities in this country to reduce it. And I think, look, for anybody, we all spend so much time supporting and working around the industry. For the folks that are watching today, I think the key thing is hopefully this can alone this discussion, whether it's the Minister of Mines or myself or our interaction with industry or reflecting on the work with First Nations. I think that alone should be able to be symbolic of our commitment to this industry. I don't think you're going to have the same level of detail in your dialogue, in many parts of the country. We think it's an extremely important industry. We always see where there's opportunities to improve on it. And we're looking at every opportunity to leverage those programs that Michael's talking about. So grid connection for us, it's not just, BC just announced last week. I'll just say, look, I think it's 36, I might be off a number, I think $36 billion commitment on infrastructure for electrification in British Columbia. They see the opportunity. It's really important. For us, we know that globally, people want to see clean energy sources supplying the energy to projects. That's what I've come to learn. We've always felt that over the last number of years. The key for the Yukon is to be connected to the North American grid. It's not just about trying to buy power from BC. It's about being able to go out to market to buy power. And many provinces and regions do that. So, it's about nation building. And the other piece for us is it's about Arctic sovereignty. This is not just this is about dual use infrastructure. It's not just about our mineral security. It's about where we are in this country, which is an entirely other conversation that actually is parallel to what we're talking about today.
I think you're absolutely right that people are wanting sustainable, renewable energy. But I would also say that they also want efficient energy that doesn't, just turn off when the weather gets bad. We had a huge cold spell, just recently through Canada and the United States, and there was a lot of stories of energy grids shutting off because of the cold. And so I would say that's equally as important as where that energy source comes from. How important? Let's shift stories. Obviously, the casino project and that story continues to be, I don't want to say a saga, but an important story to follow, because it really feels, as somebody who's been to the Yukon and has I have investments in the Yukon for a number of years. It really feels like casino can be that launch pad for mining in Yukon that everybody has wanted to happen for a very, very long time. With Rio Tinto coming in, Mitsubishi coming in, people are watching very, very closely and how this kind of plays out. Some people would say, well, it's not happening as quickly as originally intended, but at the same time, if you're going to do it, you want to do it right, and you want to get it right the first time. You have to. How important is this partnership with the major miner Rio Tinto and Mitsubishi with the casino project? How important is this for the entire landscape of mining in Yukon right now? I guess that's a question for you.
Yeah, I mean, look, if BHP or Rio Tinto are on your doorstep, that's a significant conversation in this industry. I'll say that, look, we got Newmont, so you got the world's biggest gold miner just north of where Rio is. I think, look, it's extremely important, and I'll just say how we've treated it is, I was in London because I needed to make sure that we were having discussions with Rio, and it was meeting with their CEO of the Copper Group, and it was also making sure I've got a long, collegial relationship with the chair of the board, and making sure there was conversations with Dominic. I think at the same time we were in Japan because it was important to have those discussions, and it's just as important or more important for me to be continuing to have discussions with the chief, the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation and Selkirk First Nation. I mean, this is a massive project. These communities, as Brandon said, your capacity to work through an EA process and an impact and benefit agreement, all those things are really, really important. But it is a game-changing opportunity. And you're absolutely correct. It has to be handled properly. And my sense is that's the way that Rio wants to handle things. And I think that's what Mitsubishi wants to do. They want to handle things the right way because they know how important it is. So, I feel good about where it's going. And I think there's that continued work on it. But everybody's going to be watching it. But there's other really important projects as well. I'll pick on Brandon for 1 second. That, like Mac Tung, from my knowledge, I've sat down with the Consul General of the U.S. here in Vancouver. I've sat down with the ambassador from the U.S. in Ottawa. You're talking, 50 years North American supply of tungsten with a commodity that's controlled by maybe two very unfriendly players. There's a lot of really serious opportunities. And all of those communities in the Yukon, we're just trying to support them to have the right conversations, because the things that they need and the vision they have for their community, they can meet those opportunities through those partnerships. My last bullish thing I'll say is, I had this discussion with somebody today. Canada's in a place where we need to have a resource industry. We need to have this, because when you look at where we're going to go from a standpoint, just alone, healthcare expenditures, no, we're not going to meet it by just having bilateral agreements with governments, either regionally or nationally. It's got to be driven through our economic prowess and the opportunities that we have in front of us.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight the importance of the resource industry to Canada. You take away the mining sector and the oil and gas sector, and we are a poor country, right? We would average the sort of GDP per capita of the poorest states in the U.S., right? The resource sector and the growing that is hugely important to the ongoing, job-based, tax-based wealth and prosperity of Canada, right? And I think waking people up to that is beginning to happen, I think, because of this critical mineral discussion. They're recognizing that it's mining is not just a a game where you mine something and put it in a vault, right? Like that it's beyond that. It's it's the basis for everything we do.
Mike, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention one thing. There is a map of the Yukon if you want it to go up, and the critical minerals projects.
Oh yeah, is there any way we could get that?
Okay, there we go. Just to mention something on Casino, you're right, it's a huge project, 120,000 tons a day. The reason I covered it this summer was because I understood that there was 492 different options for tailings management facility, and it was agreed on more or less by the First Nations and the government, everyone, on one. So that reduced the permitting risk. Rio had come in and endorsed it with an investment, so it Mitsubishi. So there's very little risk on a number of the project elements. The other thing I really liked about it was going to provide $250 million per year in taxes to the government. And so when you talk about paying for infrastructure and roads and power, that's one of the ways it can be done. So that was our lens on Casino in terms of valuing it, and having a thesis on the Yukon, and that being really, as the Premier said, one of the key assets in terms of size.
Well, and I think projects like Fireweeds and a few others could conceivably be powered by LNG or something like that. And that was what was in the Casino feasibility study. We could probably tap into the Yukon grid. Casino cannot. I think they draw almost more power than the entire Yukon grid produces. So really, it is the perfect poster child for the grid connection and electrification, right? Of that instead of them producing power on site. Right? I think it's such a meaningful project, and a group like Rio is the right company to build it, right? I think, unfortunately, a few troubled cases in Yukon, Minto and Wolverine and stuff like that. Big companies with big balance sheets and multiple projects take care of their projects better. They just can't, right? They have the ability to. So I think when we want to see that, we want to see Yukon, with Rios and Tex and what have you operating there.
Mike, how critical has it been for a major mining conglomerate like Rio Tinto, with obviously Mitsubishi coming in? How important has that been for the thesis of investment in not just in Casino, but all of Yukon? Like, in the investment eyes, are they the champions of this moving forward? I mean, no disrespect, but do you need a major partner, a major company to come in and really move these things forward? Yeah,
with that particular project and its capex, $3.6 billion, yes. And before I forget, there is a clean tax credit, innovation tax credit, that Casino may be eligible for, 30% of processing and mining. That'd be $758 million US off the capex, and that's part of this pool of capital, depending on how it gets deployed again. But I think Rio and BHP and other diversified miners, they want a green mine. They want something safe in Canada. There's very few of these assets in the world. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see the gold companies become very, very interested, and maybe even a syndicate. Barrick is tilted towards copper. Newmont bolting on Newcrest has added to a lot of copper and a lot of block cave technology to their base. So don't be surprised if the gold companies continue to look at investments in copper, because that's what investors are paying them for in their NAV.
I think that's a missing part of the equation, that people think about what makes the best copper mine in the world, what makes the best zinc mine or gold mine. It's big production, it's low cost, absolutely is safety, right? But a new metric that everyone's getting judged by is carbon intensity of production, right? And this is what people are forgetting. And there are new growing emerging pools of capital out there that will absolutely judge you on your carbon intensity. That's how the majors get judged. They're extremely anxious or unwilling to build big greenfields projects that are powered by fossil fuels, because it hurts them. It will hurt their share price, because there'll be a withdrawal of capital from the company. So I think that's something we all have to kind of keep in mind, and it's something per that you talk about these tax credits. And one of the things I first touched on is about how do we get more capital, the open market capital into critical minerals, because there's ample. Precious metals people may not agree with me, but there's certainly more for precious metals, and that's to make it more attractive. That is tax credits, that's exploration tax credits. There's all sorts of things that improve the ultimate returns on mines. and will drive capital to them.
Premier, maybe you can give me a little bit of education here. Me being in the U.S., I don't necessarily completely understand the intricacies between a province and a territory. Forgive me for that. But as a territory of Yukon, are you better set up to get some of these things done than you, like maybe other provinces in Canada are? And it's like a question.
Yeah, look, I think that everybody, every province and territory will come out and talk about what they believe their advantage is. Look, I think we have a great ecosystem. There's in this room right now for investors. There's individuals in the room that have decades of exploration experience. So look, this is what I'll just put it this way. I like to parallel it to a tech play. So Toronto, years ago, I remember doing a talk and they're like, we want the Google campus. And this is going to be, $5 billion of economic impact to downtown Toronto. We've got educated individuals who can do these things. So the Yukon has the highest educated population per capita in Canada. It has a tremendous amount of individuals that have a long history of being explorers, geologists, many of them in the room today. It has an ecosystem of junior mining companies that is really second to none. Like we're almost on pace this year on financing with British Columbia, even though we only have 45,000 people, and the companies that are there are doing incredible work. And now we're moving into this other opportunity to work directly in a very respectful way with Indigenous governments. And you've got multiple mandates of government that believe mining's important. And that's what I wanted to say, that spoke to earlier today. Like we see the opportunity. So that ecosystem for us is worth $5 billion in opportunity. That's the projects that are on the books. It's actually more than that. So, but it's not Toronto. It's 45,000 people that are sitting there looking at where this can go. So I think, that's what I would say. The advantage for us is I won't compare and contrast with BC or NWT. It's a special place. Like we're all here because we believe in this, and there's an exceptional opportunity, and not all the projects will go, but some will go, and the market will drive that pace, and we'll just do our very best to make sure the regulatory process is as appropriate as it needs to be. We have to learn from what we've seen in the past. It always hasn't been great in Canada when it comes to projects. Like we all know that. So what can you do better going forward? And I'd say with those things in mind, we do have an advantage.
And I think that's fair. I mean, with everything moving, it seems like everything's moving very rapidly. Although, it's kind of funny to say that because it's not necessarily moving rapidly, but it is continuing to move forward. But you and I had this conversation in November. I remember asking you about basically, through this whole process, you have, who wins and who doesn't win. But you got to have an equity of opportunity, not necessarily an equity of outcome when it comes to mine building and development in the Yukon. So how do you, kind of decide from that? How do you make sure the opportunity is there for everybody throughout Yukon? Because if you put grid power up there, that grid is going to have to expand very, very far for everybody to have the same opportunity, not just casinos. So how does that work in that grand plan of yours? And I mean, that's that would be your legacy, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah, look, it's a big project. It's been something since 2017. I think I would say I believed in. John's here. We believe in this. And projects of this magnitude, you get an opportunity in your time to do everything you can, and then it just continues on. It's like, Nunavut, for those, they signed a devolution agreement, which is an exceptional thing that happened this week, but it was 20 years in the making, right? So you do what you can to contribute to that goal. Look, I would just say, and then you have to see where projects are and understand what they can bring to the table. Okay, on the equity piece, I would say this. Going back to that comment about our needs as governments, both regionally and nationally, the tax yield that is provided, the jobs, the spin-off, that's where the government and the general population get an opportunity. Historically, when you look at the infrastructure in the Yukon, whether it's the airport, the Alaska Highway, all of these different things, the road to Skagway, Alaska, they're all legacy of mining over the years. And there's huge benefits as well as some historical challenges. But when you look at where things go, I think we're going to see Indigenous governments having very strategic equity partnerships in the future. I do. I know that maybe sort of like shakes up the entire industry, but that's where it will go in this country. It's going there. It's happening now in the Yukon. People will get strategic and they'll get very innovative in how they build their projects out in their holdings. And I think that's going to lead to great wealth creation in those nations. And inevitably, that's where the equity is. It's the communities. And for us, dollars that stay in those small communities, stay in those small communities, because those people in those smaller communities in the Yukon, they're not leaving. They've been there for thousands of years, and they can contend to reinvest in their territory. That's where I think the equity is.
Well, and Brandon's a great example of somebody who left and still can't leave the Yukon. So, Brandon, I guess we got a couple minutes left here, and I just kind of, where Mac Pass is now, and obviously it's a much different project than it was a couple years ago when I was first there. Thanks for great exploration work, and obviously you've done a great job of bringing in more capital and expanding that project. For this kind of exploration / development part of the mine cycle, what are some things that you and your peers in that same group need? Like, what do you need right now? If you were to have an ask to the premier here, what would you ask him of things you would need right now?
Yeah. Well, it's a long list, right? And but it all fundamentally boils down to the fact that we can't advance projects unless we have access to capital to do so. And one of the things I'd highlighted in the past is that you look at private equity funds or that have these closed-end funds, might be a 10-year fund or an 8-year fund with a 2-3 year redemption period or something like that. If your permitting process from, say, PEA to production, it's not just production, it's actually have to get through the period where you're ironing out the kinks as well, full commissioning. If that's longer than the fund length, they can't invest, right? Because they know that they're not going to really see the value of their investment until a project's fully commissioned and steady state. So they might look at a company like Fireweed, and if they think that the environmental assessment's creeping up and up and up, they're going to say, we can't touch you, right? So they're going to go somewhere with worse projects because they can get from that initial economic study to fully commissioned production faster and return the capital. Because the last thing you want to have to do is have redemptions during the construction period or something like that, right? So because you're not going to have that re-rate yet. So what we ask for from the governments is like, yes, bring that timeline in, deduplicate, remove the redundancy, allow me to go to the major private equity funds. And it's not just me. It's like it's the Paul West-Sells, it's everybody who's running a company in Yukon to be able to go to these funds and say, like, look, if you give me the money now, I'm going to need 2 years of baseline. It's going to take me 3 years to get the environmental assessment and a year and a half for licensing. That's it. So we're looking at whatever that is, 6.5 year process, including your baseline. Could we do better than that? Yes, but that's competitive, I think, right? We're not there now, right? It's not there right now. So I think that would be the biggest ask. And the infrastructure makes a huge difference. I think that's a huge endorsement for the mining industry when these dollars go into the infrastructure, because the government has very little interest in committing, any road or power line in Yukon if they don't think that project's getting built. Right, that's they don't want a road to nowhere, so they want to have a pretty strong feeling that project's happening. So that is a major endorsement for any company. So I think that's the major asks.
Mike, on this topic of finding capital, as best as I do that if you look at the TSX Venture Composite, it is one of the ugliest charts I have ever seen ever. It's really bad. So you have a lot of these Canadian companies, not just Yukon, but dependent on that exchange. And I remember a while ago I tweeted out, like, the Canadian market's broken, and I got a lot of hell for it. But it was there was constructive conversation about it. And listen, you're able to buy and sell, so that's the market. In my opinion, the market's not broken, but there's just not the interest in it that there once was. And so companies have to get creative of trying to find liquidity wherever they can. So for companies in Yukon, under that same premise that need to go find liquidity, where are the opportunities? Are people just getting stuck, like on the venture, trying to raise there at really low valuations, or is there opportunities to maybe go elsewhere to find that liquidity and bring it back to Yukon?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I did present in January 2020 at Roundup. The capital markets are broken. What happened from an institutional point of view is a lot of the main funds in Canada and York had 80 positions. They've gone down to 30 in the last 5 or 6 years. So concentrated portfolios and mainly producers. That doesn't leave a lot of room for explorer developers. And so not as much money, and we're finding at least, it's discovery investors. It's the Crescat Capitals, the Commodity Discovery Fund, those type of investors that want to come in on the Torquay drill bit discoveries, and ones that can actually have some momentum and deliver some superior returns. So that's really important. And in the Yukon, I think partly it's the marketing that's been done by the government. Invest Yukon has cast a really good light on the Yukon. There's not too many jurisdictions that are taking this opportunity. And then it's got the discoveries and the projects to back it up. What's attractive for Canada is the critical minerals investment tax credit that is an incentive vis-a-vis the charity flow through to mean a very low cost base for investors. So that's been a tailwind for the sector. These are not good markets for the explorers and developers right now. They're trading at low price to NAVs. But when you can have a jurisdiction with the right tailwind in terms of the messaging and things like that, it can stand out. And I think between some of the large projects, Snowline Discovery, Banyon's momentum, Eagle in production for Victoria, there's a lot of things that we're embracing. And the final thing I'll say is, because I realize we don't have too much time, is we've kind of translated our Golden Triangle thesis. In Northern BC, great geology, good First Nations relationships, and great infrastructure. And that really triggered $4.5 billion of M&A over 10 years. With zero senior mining companies really there except for Teck. Now they've got a plethora of them. Same thing in the Yukon. What's happened is, last 5 years or so, 8 senior mining companies have come in, and there's been increased M&A, and I think it's really pretty good alignment on First Nations or possibilities. That's something I'm learning more and more as I research the Yukon. And then the infrastructure piece is probably the main thing.
This may be a little bit of an anecdotal story, and then Brandon was involved. I'm from the Midwest, and a couple of weeks ago, I ended up actually taking 4 different companies to Omaha to do 1 day of marketing to a group of 12 people that had zero exposure to exploration, let alone mining. But it was, for all of them, was probably the first exposure to Yukon just by Brandon's 45-minute presentation. We didn't quite know what to expect. We were trying something new just to see if that maybe had legs. And I think I think maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but I thought the outcome was very positive. Everybody in the room had positive things to say. They were glad that they got a little bit of understanding, not only of the sector, but actually learning more about the sector in Yukon and why Mac Pass is so important, what that thesis is. And so I guess if I may say in the last minute, I would encourage every company in the Yukon and every company in Canada that are listed to think outside the box, try new things, visit with people that maybe you wouldn't have visited in the last 2 years, because you never know where those opportunities might come from. And so I guess, and I don't know if it's not necessarily a question to wrap up, or maybe less an idea about, trying new things, trying to get in front of new people in new jurisdictions, areas of the countries or other countries that are, that can provide liquidity. There's a lot of money out there still that can come.
I think it's inconceivable that you could build a successful mining company with Canadian capital alone. You just can't, right? So we have to be looking abroad.
I think we're going to wrap it at that. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Premier.
Thank you very much.
Brandon, Mike,
Thanks.
thank you.